Hello, welcome to the World War Lab channel. Today's story takes us high above Nazi Germany into one of the most terrifying survival stories of the Second World War. At 11:47 a.m. on November 29, 1943, Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran was crouched inside the tail section of a B-17F Flying Fortress nicknamed Rikki Tikki Tavi as German flak ripped through the aircraft more than 20,000 feet above the city of Bremen. Moran was just 19 years old, a tail gunner flying his 5th combat mission with the 8th Air Force's 96th Bomb Group. By this moment, 8 of his 9 crewmates were already dead. The mission had begun 4 hours earlier at RAF Snetterton Heath in England. That morning, 346 B-17 Flying Fortresses thundered down the runway and lifted into the gray sky, heading for Bremen's industrial targets. It was one of the most heavily defended cities in Germany. Bremen's anti-aircraft batteries alone had destroyed 64 bombers in the previous month. Moran's squadron had already lost 11 tail gunners since September. The bomber formation crossed the German coastline at 23,000 feet. From his position at the very back of the aircraft, Moran scanned the sky through his twin .50 caliber Browning machine guns. The tail position offered the widest field of view of any station on the bomber, but it also meant isolation. No one could reach him through the narrow crawl space. If something went wrong back there, he would face it completely alone. German fighters struck first. Messerschmitt Bf-109s dove in from above, firing their 20mm cannons. Moran tracked one fighter closing fast from the 6 o'clock position and squeezed both triggers. The guns roared. Spent brass casings bounced and clattered around his boots. The Messerschmitt rolled away trailing smoke. Then the flak began. Black bursts blossomed across the sky around the formation. Each explosion hurled razor-sharp fragments outward at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Moran felt the impacts shudder through the aircraft. Suddenly, the intercom went dead. Through the rear window, Moran watched Rikki Tikki Tavi begin to slide backward out of formation. German fighters immediately swarmed toward the crippled bomber. More cannon rounds slammed into the fuselage. Moran fired back, but the attackers came from every direction. A massive explosion tore through the aircraft. The entire nose section vanished in a flash of fire. The bombardier, navigator, pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer were instantly gone. Moments later, another shell ripped through the radio compartment, killing 3 more crewmen in the waist section. Only Moran and the navigator were still alive. The navigator bailed out. Moran was now completely alone. He reached for his parachute. What he found made his blood run cold. The canopy was shredded, riddled with bullet holes. The harness straps were torn apart. It would never open. He had no way out. Then came the hit that changed everything. A direct flak strike severed the tail section from the rest of the aircraft. The explosion was deafening. In an instant, the entire tail assembly broke free from the fuselage. Moran felt a violent lurch as gravity took hold. He was falling, still inside the tail section, 20,000 feet above Germany, with no parachute and no aircraft. The tail did not fall straight down. The vertical and horizontal stabilizers acted like crude airfoils. The severed section began to glide, spinning slowly as it descended. Moran clung to his gun handles. No training manual ever explained what to do when your airplane breaks in half. Through the rear window, he saw German fighters circling. They assumed everyone was dead. But Moran was still alive, and his guns still worked. He aimed at a Messerschmitt that swooped past and fired. Tracers arced across the sky. The German pilot banked away in shock, clearly stunned that a detached tail section was shooting back. Moran kept firing as the broken tail continued its unnatural glide downward, spinning slowly through the freezing German sky. If you want to see how this tail gunner survived a 4-mile fall, please hit the like button. It helps us share more stories like this. And subscribe if you haven't. Now, back to Moy. German anti-aircraft crews on the ground saw the tail section falling and opened fire. Moran was being shot at by fighters above and flak batteries below while plummeting inside a torn-off section of his bomber. The altimeter still worked. 19,000 feet. 18,000. The ground was rushing closer. Moran's head slammed into his gun sight. Blood streamed down into his eyes. His ribs cracked against the gun mounts, but he refused to let go. 16,000 feet. 15,000. Below him were fields and forests. The town of Syke, 12 miles south of Bremen, came into view. 14,000 feet. 13,000. He tried the escape hatch. It wouldn't move. The metal frame had warped from the explosion. He was trapped inside a metal coffin falling at over 100 miles per hour. 12,000 feet. 11,000. The spinning forced him hard against the bulkhead. The pressure was unbearable. Gold fillings and his helmet liner popped loose under the strain. 10,000 feet. 9,000. The trees below were clearly visible now. The glide angle flattened slightly. The stabilizers were doing something, barely. 8,000 feet. 7,000. Moran braced himself. No way to steer. No way to slow down. No way out. 6,000 feet. 5,000. The forest surged upward. 4,000 feet. 3,000. The tail section plunged toward the woods outside Syke. Moran could see individual pine trees now, their branches reaching upward like dark fingers. The section was still spinning, still gliding at a steep angle, but gravity was winning. 2,000 feet. 1,000. The impact came without warning. The tail section smashed into the tops of the pine trees. Branches snapped. Wood exploded. The metal frame shrieked under the strain. The vertical stabilizer caught on a thick trunk, forcing the entire section to pivot and slow. More branches shattered as the tail cartwheeled through the canopy, shedding torn sheets of aluminum skin. Then it slammed into the ground. The impact drove Moran's head into his gun sight. His skull cracked open. Blood poured from his scalp. His ribs, already fractured during the descent, shattered completely. Both forearms snapped against the gun mounts. The pain was instant and overwhelming. But he was alive. Moran tried to move. His arms did not respond. Broken. Every breath sent knives through his chest. Broken ribs. His head throbbed violently. Crushed skull. Blood flooded his eyes, blurring his vision. Then he heard voices. German voices. Boots crunching across the forest floor. Someone was coming. Two men emerged through the wreckage. They wore tattered civilian clothing, not Wehrmacht uniforms, not Luftwaffe ground crew. These were prisoners, Serbian prisoners of war, who had been working nearby when they saw the tail section fall from the sky. Both men were doctors, captured by the Germans years earlier and forced into labor camps. When they witnessed the American tail section crash into the trees, they ran toward it. They expected to find A. Instead, they found Moran barely conscious, choking on his own blood. The Serbian doctors had no equipment, no medicine, no bandages, but they had training, and that was enough to act. They dragged Moran clear of the wreckage and laid him on the forest floor. One man stabilized his head while the other examined his injuries with grim efficiency. A crushed skull. Both forearms broken. Multiple shattered ribs. Internal bleeding almost certain. They knew German patrols would arrive at any moment, so they worked fast. One doctor tore strips from his own shirt and wrapped Moran's mangled arms into crude bindings. The other pressed hard against the gaping wound in Moran's scalp, fighting to slow the bleeding. Within minutes, German soldiers arrived and surrounded the crash site with rifles raised. When they saw Moran, motionless, blood-soaked, barely breathing, they lowered their weapons. This man was no threat. He was barely alive. The soldiers placed Moran onto a stretcher. The Serbian doctors demanded to go with him, and after a brief hesitation, the Germans agreed. Moran was transported to a military hospital in Bremen, the same city he had been bombing just hours earlier. German doctors examined him and quietly shook their heads. His injuries were catastrophic. The crushed skull alone should have been fatal. Broken ribs had punctured his lungs. Both forearms were shattered beyond recognition. He had lost an enormous amount of blood. By every medical standard, he should already have been dead. But the Serbian doctors refused to abandon him. They stayed at his bedside through the night, monitoring his breathing and checking his pulse again and again. Despite orders to prioritize their own wounded, German medical staff provided what supplies they could spare. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, the pain was unbearable. When unconscious, he dreamed of falling, always falling, the tail section spinning, the earth rushing upward, pine trees reaching for him. 3 days passed, then 4. Slowly, his condition stabilized. The crushed skull began to heal, though the pressure on his brain remained dangerous. His ribs started to knit together. His forearms were still useless, but the bones were beginning to set. On the 5th day, German intelligence officers arrived. They wanted information, bombing targets, formation tactics, radio frequencies. Moran gave them nothing. Name, rank, serial number. That was all. The interrogations continued for 2 weeks. The Germans tried threats, promises of better treatment, and long stretches of isolation. Moran said nothing. Eventually, they gave up. On December 14, 1943, guards loaded Moran onto a truck alongside other Allied prisoners. The vehicle traveled east through Germany for 3 days. Moran sat in the back with 14 other American airmen. His arms were still held in makeshift splints. His head wound had crusted over, but infection was setting in. Every bump in the road sent fresh agony through his fractured ribs. On December 17th, they arrived at Stalag Luft 3. The camp held nearly 10,000 Allied airmen housed in wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. At the gate, guards searched each prisoner, taking Moran's dog tags, his wedding ring, and the few personal items he had left. The barracks were bitterly cold. Each room held 32 men sleeping in wooden bunks stacked tightly together. A single coal stove provided heat, but coal rations were scarce. Each prisoner received 2 thin blankets. That winter, temperatures dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Food arrived twice a day. Breakfast was 1 slice of black bread and ersatz coffee brewed from burned barley. Supper was a thin soup, sometimes containing potato peelings if prisoners were lucky. Red Cross parcels did arrive, but most were confiscated by the guards. Instead of 1 parcel per week, prisoners received 1 per month. Moran's arms healed incorrectly. Without proper medical care, the bones fused at the wrong angles. He could move his fingers, but his forearms remained twisted and weak. Simple tasks became impossible: buttoning a shirt, tying boots, holding a spoon. Other prisoners stepped in to help him without question. The camp operated a secret radio, assembled from smuggled parts over 18 months. It was hidden behind a false wall in Barracks 14. Each night, selected prisoners listened to BBC broadcasts and carefully transcribed the news. By morning, the information spread through the camp. In January 1944, the radio reported that Allied bombing raids over Germany were intensifying. In February came news of the battle for Monte Cassino. In March, reports confirmed massive air attacks on Berlin. Every update meant more bombers in the sky, more crews shot down, and more prisoners arriving at Stalag Luft 3. On March 24, 1944, the camp exploded into chaos. 76 prisoners escaped through a tunnel known as Harry. They had been digging for more than a year, burrowing 30 feet underground to slip beneath the perimeter wire. The tunnel stretched 336 feet from Barracks 104 to the forest beyond the fence. The escape lasted only 1 night. At dawn, German guards discovered the tunnel. A massive manhunt followed. 70,000 troops, police, and Hitler Youth were mobilized. Within 2 weeks, 73 of the escapees were recaptured. 50 were executed by the Gestapo, shot individually in different locations on direct orders from Hitler himself. The remaining 23 prisoners were returned to the camp. Guards posted the names of the dead on the bulletin board. The camp fell silent as prisoners read the list. Security tightened immediately. Roll calls increased from twice a day to 5 times. All movement after dark was banned. Barracks were searched weekly. Tools, wire, anything that could be used for digging was confiscated. Moran watched it all from his bunk. His arms were slowly regaining some function, but he remained physically limited. Other prisoners included him anyway. They shared food with him. They helped him dress. They told him stories about home. Months passed. Summer arrived. The war dragged on. On June 6th, the secret radio reported Allied landings in Normandy. Today, prisoners celebrated quietly, careful not to draw attention. Guards responded by tightening control even further. By autumn, by late 1944, the Eastern Front was collapsing. Soviet forces were driving relentlessly toward Germany, and the secret radio confirmed it night after night. Russian tanks were reported at 300 miles, then 200, then 100. On January 27, 1945, German guards ordered the evacuation of all prisoners. The Soviets were less than 50 miles from the camp. The march began at 4 a.m. in the middle of a blizzard. 10,000 prisoners formed columns on the road outside Stalag Luft 3. Each man carried a single blanket and whatever scraps of food he could scavenge. The guards issued no additional rations. The temperature was 15 degrees below zero. The guards said they were marching west, away from the Soviet advance. They did not say how far. They did not say where the prisoners were going. They made only one thing clear: anyone who fell behind would be shot. The column moved out at dawn. Moran's arms still ached from injuries suffered 13 months earlier. His ribs had healed, but the cold air made every breath painful. He wrapped his blanket tightly around his shoulders and began walking. The first man died on the second day, an American bombardier from Ohio who collapsed face-first into the snow. Guards dragged his body to the roadside and forced the column to keep moving. By the third day, 4 more prisoners were dead. By the end of the first week, 23 bodies lay frozen along the route. The prisoners marched for 12 hours each day. Guards allowed 10-minute breaks every 2 hours. At night, they herded the men into barns or churches when possible. Other nights, they slept in open fields under falling snow. Temperatures dropped to 20 below zero. Food became the only thing anyone thought about. The guards provided nothing. Prisoners melted snow in their mouths for water. Some dug frozen potatoes from abandoned fields. Others tore bark from trees and chewed it raw. A few traded personal belongings to German civilians for crusts of bread. Most simply starved. After the first week, Moran's feet blistered badly. The blisters burst, became infected, and filled with fluid. With every step, he felt it squish inside his boots. Others suffered far worse. Frostbite turned toes and fingers black. Some men lost parts of their feet but kept walking because stopping meant death. The march dragged on through February. Some days the column covered 20 miles, other days 10. When blizzards reduced visibility to almost nothing, they managed 5 miles at best. The guards pushed them forward regardless of conditions. By mid-February, the column had covered nearly 200 miles. They passed through abandoned German towns where civilians watched silently from windows but offered no help. Everyone knew the war was ending. Germany was collapsing, yet the march continued. Some prisoners tried to escape. Most failed. Near a wooded area outside a town called Sturmberg, 3 men ran for the trees. Guards shot them immediately and left their bodies where they fell as a warning. Other prisoners simply gave up. They sat down in the snow and refused to move. The guards shot them as well. 73 prisoners died during the first month alone. After that, the survivors stopped counting. Moran kept walking. His infected feet screamed with every step. His arms throbbed constantly. His ribs burned with pain in the cold air. Still, he moved forward, 1 foot after another, hour after hour, day after day. The column crossed into central Germany. Soviet artillery rumbled in the distance behind them. American bombers flew overhead, heading east. The guards grew increasingly nervous. They knew the war was lost, but they continued to follow their orders. Keep the prisoners moving. Do not let them fall into enemy hands. On March 15, 1945, after 47 days on the road, the column reached the town of Bitterfeld. Guards herded the prisoners into an old factory building. They said it was temporary. They said transportation would arrive soon. The prisoners collapsed onto the factory floor. Most could no longer stand. Moran's feet had swollen so badly that his boots could not be removed. 3 weeks passed inside the factory at Bitterfeld. The guards brought no food. Prisoners survived on whatever scraps they could find inside the building. Rats became targets. Men caught them and roasted them over small fires. Others ate grass and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete floor. Moran's weight dropped below 100 pounds. He had weighed 165 pounds when his B-17 was shot down 16 months earlier. His ribs protruded sharply beneath his skin. His face was skeletal. His infected feet oozed constantly. Other prisoners were worse. Dysentery spread rapidly through the factory. Men too weak to stand soiled themselves where they lay. The stench became unbearable. German guards remained outside. They provided no medicine, no bandages, nothing at all. On April 8th, the prisoners heard artillery. Close artillery. American artillery. The sound came from the west and grew louder each day. The guards became agitated, whispering among themselves. Some disappeared during the night. By April 10th, small arms fire echoed through Bitterfeld. American infantry had entered the town. The German guards abandoned the factory. They left the doors unlocked and simply walked away. The prisoners were too weak to celebrate. Most could not even stand. They lay on the factory floor listening to the sounds of battle outside. Machine guns, tank cannons, and the sharp crack of M1 Garand rifles. On April 11, 1945, at 2 p.m., American soldiers from the 104th Infantry Division kicked open the factory doors. They froze when they saw what lay inside. Hundreds of skeletal men, lying in their own filth. The smell hit immediately. Several soldiers stumbled back outside and vomited. A medic entered first, moving from man to man, checking pulses and assessing conditions. When he reached Moran, he shook his head. The Wisconsin farm boy was still breathing, but barely. His pulse was weak. His feet were gangrenous. His body was shutting down. Medics called for stretchers and began carrying prisoners outside to waiting ambulances. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness during the transport. He remembered seeing American flags. He remembered hearing English spoken around him. He remembered crying. The field hospital was 15 miles west. Army doctors worked through the night treating the freed prisoners. They cut away Moran's boots. His feet were black with necrosis. The doctors debated amputation but decided to attempt to save them first. They flooded his system with sulfa drugs and penicillin, cleaned his wounds, gave him plasma, and stabilized his condition. On April 13th, he was transferred to a larger hospital in France. Recovery took months. The infection in his feet slowly receded, millimeter by millimeter. By June, his weight had climbed back to 120 pounds. His arms regained most of their function, though they remained slightly twisted from the way the bones had healed improperly. On July 3, 1945, doctors cleared Moran for transport back to the United States. He boarded a hospital ship at Le Havre. The Atlantic crossing took 8 days. On July 11th, the ship entered New York Harbor. Moran stood on deck as the Statue of Liberty emerged from the haze. He had been gone for 2 years and 9 months. He had flown 5 combat missions. He had fallen 4 miles inside a severed tail section. He had survived 17 months as a prisoner of war. He had walked nearly 600 miles through a German winter. He was 21 years old. The ship docked at Pier 90. Army personnel helped the former prisoners down the gangway as crowds cheered from behind barriers. Someone played the national anthem over loudspeakers. Moran could not stop crying. He was home. From New York, he traveled by train to Camp Kilmer in New Jersey, where Army doctors conducted full medical examinations on all returning prisoners. Every injury, every scar, every lasting effect of captivity was documented. Moran's medical report filled 11 pages. A crushed skull with healed fractures. Both forearms improperly healed at 15-degree angles. 6 ribs with old fracture lines. Chronic lower back pain from spinal compression during the fall. Nerve damage in both feet from frostbite and infection. Organ damage caused by malnutrition. Post-traumatic stress. The doctors recommended 3 additional months of treatment. Moran refused. He wanted to go home. He wanted to see his family. He had not seen them since October 1942, nearly 3 years earlier. On July 25th, the Army granted him 30 days of leave. He took a bus to Wisconsin. The trip took 2 days. He slept most of the way, still rebuilding his strength. His family met him at the bus station in Soldiers Grove. His mother did not recognize him at first. The skeletal man stepping off the bus looked nothing like the son she remembered. When she realized it was Eugene, she collapsed. His father caught her before she hit the ground. Moran spent August at home, sleeping in his old bed, eating his mother's cooking, and walking the same farm he had left 3 years earlier. Neighbors stopped by daily. They asked questions. What was it like? Were the Germans cruel? Did he kill anyone? How did he survive the fall? Moran answered some questions. Others he could not. Some memories were still too raw. The spinning tail section, the screaming wind, the bodies of his crewmates, the death march, the factory at Bitterfeld. On September 1, 1945, Moran returned to active duty at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin. The war with Japan had ended 2 weeks earlier. The Army was rapidly demobilizing. Millions of soldiers were being discharged. Moran's discharge papers arrived on December 1st. Final rank, Staff Sergeant. Service dates, October 1942 to December 1945. Combat missions, 5. Status, honorably discharged. His medals arrived separately. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. The Air Medal with a gold leaf cluster for aerial achievement. The European Theater Medal for service in the European campaign. The Good Conduct Medal. The Prisoner of War Medal. There was no medal for falling 4 miles inside a severed tail section while firing at enemy fighters. Moran returned to Soldiers Grove as a civilian. He was 22 years old with no college education and no clear job prospects. The family farm needed help, so he worked the fields, planting and harvesting crops, tending livestock, the same work he had done before the war. But everything felt different. The weight of tools in his twisted arms. The pain in his feet after long days standing. The nightmares that woke him every night. The sound of aircraft engines that made his body freeze without warning. In 1947, he met a woman named Helen at a church social. They married 6 months later. Over the next decade, they had 9 children. Moran worked construction jobs to support his family. He never complained about his injuries. He never spoke about the war unless directly asked. For decades, his story remained largely unknown. His crewmates were dead. The navigator who had bailed out moved to California and eventually lost contact. The Serbian doctors who saved his life disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. German records of the incident were scattered or destroyed. In 2007, a local Wisconsin newspaper published a short article about Moran. The headline read, "Local Veteran Survived Impossible Fall." The article caught the attention of John Armster, a military historian from Iowa who had been researching 8th Air Force bomber losses over Germany. When he read about Moran's survival, he drove to Wisconsin to interview him. Moran was 83 years old. He still lived in Soldiers Grove. His wife Helen had died 3 years earlier. His 9 children visited often. His hands still bore the crooked angles left by his shattered forearms 64 years before. Armster spent 3 days interviewing Moran, recording everything: the mission briefing on November 29th, the fighter attacks, the flak, the moment the tail section tore away, the fall, the Serbian doctors, Stalag Luft 3, the death march, all of it. Moran spoke slowly and carefully, recalling details he had not spoken aloud in decades. He showed Armster his discharge papers, his medals, wartime photographs, and a letter from the navigator who had bailed out, sent in 1946 and never answered. Armster began researching the incident in depth. He contacted the American Air Museum in Britain, which held records for Rikki Tikki Tavi, serial number 42 to 30,359, assigned to the 339th Bomb Squadron and listed as missing in action on November 29, 1943. Crew, 10. Killed in action, 8. Prisoners of war, 2. He located missing air crew report number 1392. It listed the crew names, the mission details, and the location where the bomber was last seen. Near Bremen, was listed as enemy aircraft. Armster traveled to Germany and located the town of Syke, 12 miles south of Bremen. There, he interviewed elderly residents who still remembered November 1943. Several recalled seeing a detached tail section falling slowly from the sky. One man, who had been 6 years old at the time, remembered watching from inside a bomb shelter as it crashed into the forest. A German researcher named Ulf Kapp had independently documented the incident years earlier. He had located the impact site deep in the woods, where fragments of aluminum skin were still buried in the soil more than 70 years later. He had interviewed witnesses and carefully mapped the debris field. Armster and Kapp combined their research, comparing notes, documents, and eyewitness accounts. In 2018, they organized a formal commemoration in Syke. Moran's family was invited. 6 of his 9 children traveled to Germany for the event. The town of Syke erected a memorial plaque at the crash site, listing the names of all 10 crew members of the bomber. The dedication ceremony took place on November 29, 2018, exactly 75 years after the crash. Moran's children stood in the forest where their father had fallen. They saw the trees, the clearing, and the spot where the tail section had finally come to rest. German citizens who had witnessed the crash as children stood beside them. They shared their memories and expressed gratitude that Moran had survived. The family met German researchers who had preserved the story for decades. They also met the grandson of one of the Serbian doctors who had saved Moran's life. They visited the hospital in Bremen where German doctors had treated him and stood on sections of road where the death march had passed. Moran himself was not there. He had died 4 years earlier, on March 23, 2014. He was 90 years old. He had lived 69 years after falling 4 miles inside a severed B-17 tail section. But his story endured. In 2022, John Armster published a book about Moran's experience titled Tail Spin. The book documented everything: the mission, the fall, the survival, the captivity, the death march, and the long life that followed. It included photographs Armster had collected over years of research: Moran as a young airman in 1943, the crew of Rikki Tikki Tavi standing beside their bomber, the impact site in the German forest, the memorial plaque in Syke, and Moran in his 80s sitting in his Wisconsin home, holding his Purple Hearts. Armster also interviewed aviation experts to understand how Moran had survived the fall. Aeronautical engineers analyzed the structure of the tail section. The vertical stabilizers stood 13 feet tall. The horizontal stabilizers spanned 43 feet. Together, they created enough surface area to generate lift. The tail's weight distribution was critical. The guns, ammunition, and Moran himself were all positioned toward the forward end of the section, creating a natural balance point. The stabilizers effectively acted as wings. Instead of plunging straight down, the tail section glided, spinning slowly and descending at roughly 70 miles per hour rather than terminal velocity. The forest provided the final factor. The pine trees outside Syke stood more than 80 feet tall. The tail section struck branches at the top of the canopy. Each snapping branch absorbed energy. The vertical stabilizer caught on a thick trunk, pivoting the section and further slowing its descent. The final impact speed may have dropped from 70 miles per hour to closer to 30. Still deadly under most circumstances, but the combination of factors gave Moran a chance. Only 2 other documented cases exist of airmen surviving similar falls. British tail gunner Nicholas Alcomade fell 18,000 feet without a parachute in March 1944 and lived. American ball turret gunner Alan McGee fell 22,000 feet in January 1943, crashing through the glass roof of a train station, and survived. All 3 men shared critical factors. They remained with wreckage that created drag. They struck objects that broke their fall, trees for Alcomade and Moran, a glass roof for McGee. They were young, physically fit, and extraordinarily lucky. Moran never considered himself lucky. He had lost 8 crewmates on November 29, 1943. He endured 17 months as a prisoner of war. He survived a 600-mile death march through a German winter. He carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of his life. But he lived. He came home. He married. He raised 9 children. He worked. He built a life. He lived to be 90 years old. On October 18, 2008, the town of Soldiers Grove dedicated a street in his honor. They named it Moran Way. Eugene attended the ceremony with his family. He was 84 years old. He stood beside the new street sign, smiling, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. When someone asked him how it felt to have a street named after him, he said it felt strange. He had only done what he had to do. Survive, come home, live his life. That was Eugene Paul Moran, a farm boy from Wisconsin who fell 4 miles and refused to die. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps us continue sharing these forgotten histories with more people who need to hear them. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. We're uncovering more incredible survival stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss them. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and whether anyone in your family has a World War II story that's never been told. We'd love to hear it. Thank you for watching. And thank you, Eugene Moran, for showing us what the human spirit can endure. We won't forget.